women have always been fighting this struggle to make themselves known, to, I don't know, speak some truth to a community that may not want to hear it, but they're there. They're there and they need to be heard.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 70th episode of Pine Copper Line, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Line on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperline.com. We also have a Patreon page, through which supporters toss a buck or two in our tip hat every month, and it helps keep PCL on the airs and at your inky fingertips. You also get kind of cool thank yous, like stickers and totes. If that sounds like something you'd be into, check out the link in the show notes. If you just want to chill out and listen, that's bloody okay too. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Print friends, I am pleased as punch to let you know that Pine Copper Live is finally offering merch. That's right, you can get that PCL logo and rock it to the grocery store if that's the only place you're going out, or just feel sexy with yourself around the house. But we did not stop at the logo. No. You know your friend Miranda loves a dad print joke. So we have a variety of designs to wow your friends and confuse your family this holiday season. All available on TeePublic. Check it out, link in the show notes. PCL is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been bringing you a diverse range of high-quality products since 1997. Screen printers usually associate Speedball with their wooden frames and craft squeegees, but they actually also have a very nice selection of aluminum frames in higher mesh counts, scoop coaters, urethane squeegees, and squeegee racks that are all quite accessibly priced. So, do you want to find out more? Or learn where you can pick up your new favorite screen printing accessories? Check out speedballart.com. This episode is also brought to you by McLean's Printing Supplies. Their small specialist team in the Pacific Northwest is the leading supplier of Japanese relief tools for printmaking in the US and abroad. Our editor, Timothy Pauschak's two favorite tools are his Fatsutsubari Sanka Kuto 3mm V-gouge and his Josue Maruto 1mm U-gouge, both from McLean's. But you don't have to take our word for it because these tools speak for themselves. So head on over to McLean's at imcleans.com to find your new favorite tool and keep on carving. My guest this week is Christina Weyl, who has recently published a book with Yale University Press titled The Women of Atelier 17, Modernist Printmaking in Midcentury New York. And you are in for a treat, print friends. Christina is a wealth of information on 20th century printmaking. We'll learn about how World War II caused the studio to move from France to New York, its connections to the New School and the Surrealists, as well as the famous and infamous women who came out of it. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to take a trip back in time with Christina Weyl. Hi, Christina. How's it going?
Hi, Miranda. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for joining me in your New York evening and my Bangkok morning. I'm really looking forward to learning more about your project.
Thanks very much. It's, I think, very topical and exciting time to be working on women artists. And, you know, every day I feel like I'm reminded of why this is such an important topic to be talking about.
Well, before we dive into kind of the specifics of your research and your new book, Would you give a brief introduction for anyone listening, just to kind of ground them in who you are and where you are and how it is you would describe what you do, generally speaking?
I would call myself an independent scholar, an independent curator and writer. I am based in New York City, where my family is. We have just come back after a long hiatus with grandparents during the COVID summer, and very happily back here in New York. And kind of picking up where we left off. And certainly Atelier 17 is always on the forefront of my mind. But as you know, I have, a couple of pots on the stove, and one of them is a show that unfortunately has been postponed due to COVID, but was a part of a sort of larger movement of cultural institutions, museums that were trying to organize a sort of massive celebration of women as a sort of way to honor the passage of the 19th Amendment. And many of those activities are still happening. It's part of the Feminist Art Coalition. Some of them are being delayed until the spring, and I think mine in particular is being delayed for 2 years. But it will be at Arcadia University in the fall of 2022. And it basically, it's sort of a spin-off of what I was doing in my book research, which was the women artists of Atelier 17. It's all about women artists who are part of this major printmaking studio, particularly known for its engraving and intaglio printmaking, that was based both in Paris and in New York. My book specifically talked about women, almost 100, who were members of the studio during its time in New York City, which was 1940 to 1955. And as I was doing all of my research, I think, one of the major questions you get asked all the time by both your dissertation advisor and your writing groups, and then as you're thinking of publishing, your publishers, well, so what? So what? What is all this work that you've done, this research that you've done? Like, why should we care about this? And I think one of the major takeaways for me was not just the amazing things that these women did, because they did do tremendous and amazing work at the atelier during their time there. But for me, it was just this broader movement of women that I started noticing, who were increasingly looking at printmaking as a platform from which to build a career in the arts, in an environment that was not particularly welcoming to women painters or women sculptors, although there were obviously many women painters and sculptors. It just was that printmaking was kind of this back door in a way where women could come in, they could get into print annuals, which were held quite frequently in the 40s and the 50s into the early 60s, and kind of get their name in the art newspapers and the magazines, and just get some notoriety and some name recognition with curators who were in museums. And so that was really important for them. And then I started to see, not only were they building a professional sort of CV, they were also making friends with one another. They were writing to one another. As I was doing all this research in artists' archives, I was seeing the correspondence that's going back and forth between artists about, well, you should apply for this residency and you should apply for this annual. It's really great. I know this curator here. I'll bring your work to them. I'll show them your portfolio. Just send me something. And it just was so fascinating to see these friendships and these relationships and these bonds of collegiality building between women particularly towards the late 40s, but into the 50s. And just struck me as the beginnings of some of the feminist collective activity that we start to see in the late 60s. And so many of these women, they didn't think of themselves as feminists in the 40s or 50s. It wasn't a word that was used all that often. Though some of them, as the movement coalesced, definitely came out and said, affirmed very strongly, I am a feminist. But it just struck me that there was all this activity that was happening in the arts community in New York around printmaking. And so that's where this show at Arcadia University comes out of, is that what so what question that I was always asked as I was doing my research. So what? And so we have put together a small show with a few artists showing these connections between them. And they're very pointed connections. All the artists have a connection to one another in some demonstrable way through the work that we have on view and through some primary documents that we'll have that are letters that are back and forth between them, or just show these connections that they had.
So how did you come to develop this interest in mid-20th century printmaking, and particularly Atelier 17? It sounds like this was part of a doctoral research?
Yes, absolutely. So I worked for many years, for 4 years, at printer publisher Gemini Gel in Los Angeles. And after 4 years, I had decided that it was time to go back to graduate school, and did all of my coursework. And as I was coming to an end of the coursework, my dissertation advisor sort of gently pushed me towards, you have to pick a topic to write about for your dissertation. So anyway, I had worked with her on a seminar paper about Louise Nevelson's prints that she had made at Atelier 17. And what I had discovered was, when you look at her catalogue raisonné of her prints, they're these black and white prints that she had made at Hollander Graphic Workshop with Erwin Hollander in the 60s. And they were re-editions, they were second editions of plates that she had made in the late 40s and the 50s at Atelier 17. And so then I just sort of started to pursue this, and I ended up going to the Brooklyn Museum, which has a collection of 30 prints that she had made in the 50s. So these aren't the later editions. These aren't these sort of like uniform, all identical prints that she had done at her Hollander Graphic Workshop. These were hand-colored, completely unique. Some of them were so thickly inked, the plates, that there was ink dripping down the plate margins, with her inky thumbprints, along the margins. Or in one case, the paper had torn because they were often using cheap paper, sometimes surplus paper from the war. One of the sheets had torn, and she put a piece of gold paper behind it. So these are just these wonderfully unique objects that she donated to the Brooklyn Museum. They had a show of her prints in the 60s. And so that was really what hooked me. I saw these and I thought, I got to learn more about this. And so then I kind of started to look at this list of artists who participated in Atelier 17 that was published by Joan Moser. She wrote the catalog about the studio when it was celebrating its 50th anniversary. And I think it started with something like 50 or 60 names. And then by the end of almost a decade of poking around, I had found almost 50 more. And so that's just sort of how it came to be. This dissertation then became a book, and there was a lot more work that happened between finishing that at Rutgers University and sort of publishing the book in 2019. But a lot of fun.
Definitely. So I think just before we sort of dive into more of that individual experience of the women in it and their relationships, because I think that's really interesting in this idea of this sort of early feminism collectives that, of course, I think we associate very much with the 1960s. But of course, nothing appears in a bubble, right? So that lead up to this really strong movement that I think we usually associate with the following decade, I think is really interesting. And of course, the way printmaking and community build into that. But just to give a bit background for listeners into the context in which this was happening, can you tell us a bit about just the history of Atelier 17 and really kind of maybe from when it began to how and why you think it became a place that was more welcoming to women, maybe than painting and sculpture environments.
Oh, sure. So for those who are not familiar, Atelier 17 is sort of synonymous with this British engraver whose name is Stanley William Hayter. Everyone called him Bill Hayter. He was sort of raised and educated in England, had this wonderful British accent, and in his 20s, he had gone off to work in oil fields in the Middle East and contracted malaria.
Oh my gosh.
Came home and decided that he was going to become an artist. And so he had made all these paintings while on the oil rigs. He had a background in chemistry and some other sciencey. He had this sort of both creative but also scientific side to him. So when he came back to England, he sold the paintings that he had made and used the proceeds from that sale to go to Paris, which at the time in the mid-20s was sort of the center of the art world.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually befriended a number of both English-speaking, but he was starting to learn French, but English-speaking expatriates were really his go-to in those early years. So he met a woman who had studied at the Art Students League in New York City with Joseph Pennell through his Hayter's girlfriend. And then this woman whose name was Mary Huntoon taught him some of the very basics of aquatint and other, I think they did some sugar lift. They did just some basic line, hard ground work. And then through, more networking, he found Joseph Hecht, who was this Polish engraver. And then from there, he just kind of, I think through some prodding, through some other English-speaking, they were women, who came to his studio and said, we saw your work, we really like it, would you teach us how to make an engraving? Mm-hmm. And I think initially he brushed them off, but then there was just enough momentum that it kept growing and it built. And then by the late 20s, he had sort of formally opened this studio, and it didn't really have its name until the mid-30s when it moved to a new location on the left bank, and its address was 17 Rue Campagne Première. Uh-huh. And so that's how it got its name, Atelier 17. And at that point, Hayter had started to associate himself with Surrealists. You had Max Ernst coming, Giacometti was coming, Picasso was coming for advice. But then there were a lot of other women who were there who were very they're beginning, I think, to be better appreciated. And I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, you had Helen Phillips, who later marries Hayter, who becomes this great sort of surrealist sculptor. Flora Blanc, a reader who was married to, she wasn't at that point, she was married to Dixon Reader, who was part of the Fort Worth circle of artists, mid-century artists who were in Fort Worth, Texas. And they all are in Paris, and they come home and they sort of bring this sort of homegrown surrealism to Texas. Dalla Husband, who was a Canadian artist who was also fantastic. Unfortunately, she died in the mid-20s. Nina Negri, who's Argentinian, who was working in a surrealist way. A Swedish artist whose name was Siri Rasman. She was also working in surrealist style. So anyway, that's just all to say that surrealism was very much part of the beginnings of the studio. And then as the war begins and the Nazis invade Paris, Hayter moves the studio to America. And he stops in New York. He meets some people from the New School for Social Research. And the New School had been founded right after World War I. It was sort of a place for a new form of sort of humanities and social science research where everything was supposed to be more egalitarian and professors were supposed to be on equal footing with students, and they were bringing in a different swath of students. It wasn't just an elitist university. It was meant for everyone. It was meant for people who were coming to learn after their day jobs, so they had a lot of evening lectures and things like that. So anyway, this is the home. They had a university in exile where they were bringing in lots of European professors who lost their jobs as a result of the war or political or religious persecution. And so Hayter kind of falls in with this resurgence of the New School, this like great flourishing of reformation of Europe in New York. And a lot of his former pals from Paris are resettling in New York. And Surrealism really kind of takes hold at the New School. And there are lectures, there are other professors who are teaching there, who are affiliated in some way with Surrealism or influenced by it. And so that's where it is for 4 or 5 years after it moves to New York. And I think it's at the New School that it really becomes this egalitarian center, because the New School had this premise that you could not discriminate in letting anybody into your course, that it was to be open for amateurs and for professionals. It was to be open to men and to women. And, the premise was that even though he said there was portfolio review and he was a little intimidating, he couldn't really turn anyone away. I mean, that just wasn't part of what the New School was all about. So I think it was that, that really jump-started Atelier 17 as being this place where women could come and could get this education in printmaking. And it's not that they couldn't have gotten that at a place like the Art Students League or up at Teachers College at Columbia University. There were people who were teaching printmaking. There was just something about the type of people who were coming to Atelier 17 at the New School that was so much more professional and sort of an elevated group of people. And it was just, I think, intoxicating for people to be in this room, to be a fly in the wall, to be among Juan Moreau when he comes in to see what's happening. And you are a 25-year-old American artist who's never been to Paris, never been out of your country, and to be exposed to that level of just thought was so enticing. So that was how Atelier 17 became, I think, so well regarded in the New York arts community, but also just how it became a more accessible place for anybody to come.
And so when you say accessible for anyone, was this like gender and race and class lines? Was it truly open in that way?
Well, that's a question that I think about a lot, especially in light of what we have gone through, what we've seen this summer and sort of the reckoning. I was only ever able to find 2 women, African Americans, who worked at the studio. And that's out of almost 100. So I think that in itself shows you that the arts community was not integrated at all, at least in this little microcosm. Bob Blackburn worked there very briefly. He was very close friends with an artist who I studied, who was a refugee from Czechoslovakia, whose name was Terry Haas, and they became lifelong friends. But she was the one who taught him some of what he learned about intaglio printmaking, and I think she also was learning lithography from him. In terms of class, I think there was often accusations that the women who were coming to the studio were wearing mink coats, or that they were of a particular amateur level. And I think that was kind of a way of brushing aside some of this insecurity that people had about opening up the studio to other people. And I think that there were certainly people who had more economically advantaged positions. They were women who had gotten married and had children and were in families where they didn't have to work and they didn't have to have 2 jobs. But they had always maintained an interest in the arts. So it wasn't like they were coming in their 40s and were all of a sudden, the woman with the diamond ring on. But definitely there were also artists who came from nothing, for whom this was just the most amazing experience they'd ever had. And they talked about it later in their lives. So I wouldn't say it was the most diverse cross-section, but certainly I think in terms of class, like if you could make it in New York, you could probably get your foot in the door here.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question too about access. And, I think you made a really good point in that you were saying that, these were women who were going because they didn't have to work. So you can make sure that you're there on the day that Juan Moreau is there because, you can leave the kids with the nanny and come on in and that kind of thing. So I think that, access is always a really complicated question because, just because it's there and it's open on paper, does that really mean that anyone can come in and all of that kind of thing? And something that I think is good that we're all thinking about more and studying more and hopefully bringing it into contemporary mindset as well, in the arts for sure.
Definitely. I think most of the women who did come and had kids had a family member who was helping. It wasn't necessarily that they had babysitters. I mean, even Hayter's wife, Helen Phillips, had small children during the time Atelier 17 was in New York, and she just they didn't have the money and they didn't have babysitters. And one of the artists who was in the show and was in my book, Anne Ryan, she was this sort of grandmotherly figure because she was in her 50s when she started to work as an artist. She'd always been a poet and very creative, but she would babysit for the Hayter, Phillips family. And it's just, I think it's indicative of where we are today. Literally where I am today. I do not have enough, babysitter care, school support to continue with my work. And it reminds me so much of what these women were struggling with in the 40s. They were having to make these sacrifices like literally every day about how am I going to advance my career while also not giving up on my family. It's a really hard thing to manage.
And it's something that is, at least in the States, I think throughout the world, but particularly in first world countries or developed countries or however you want to say it, in the United States, it's so present currently. I have a group of several friends from college who are Danish, I met in Seattle when they were studying abroad, and they've gone back to Denmark. And, as I followed their life and kept in touch, the women in that group, their experiences with having children while working, of course, has just been profoundly different than any American women I've known who've made that choice, because they get that support from the government, because they get affordable childcare, because, creating a life where the woman is going to be the primary caretaker of the child, that they don't have to choose between being sort of this member of the world outside of being a mother. And it's, so I think it's present in the 1940s. And as you say, it's very present in 2020 for many women, and particularly now that a lot of women are schooling the children from home. And so that free public school, take the kids for, how many hours a day is no longer functioning in a lot of places due to COVID. And so it's huge sacrifices and choices I'm sure women are making across America right now.
Yep.
So I was really, when you first reached out to me and you were sort of describing some of this research you were doing, I was really keen to hear more about this foundations of feminist collectives or women collectives that happens, as you sort of say, like a little bit later on in our sort of art history timeline. And then hearing you speak about it now, it sounds like a lot of these ideas came from, really seeing the way that the women were interacting and the fact that you've gotten your hands on these primary documents from the letters and that kind of thing. And so I would love it if you could speak to really that element of your research and kind of what you were seeing in your research that you were saying, I think this is the seeds of something, and I'm seeing something about the way these women are interacting that can kind of be connected to this broader understanding of the way female artists come together to create collectives that are then, powerful and can serve as movements and really, political forces that we see sort of later on.
Well, I'll tell you two anecdotes, and this is, one of the other things I'm so passionate about is just like artists saving their archives, and so many artists who I've encountered where I've met family members and they've talked about throwing out boxes of letters and things like that, and so I feel so lucky that I was able to find a few artists for whom there were very extensive material for me to look through. Some at the Archives of American Art, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, and some in other institutions or privately held papers. But one of the first previews I got of this was sort of the collections of letters that I found with an artist named Warden Day, who was an artist who kind of began as a painter. She was from a rural upbringing in Virginia, a very religious family, but she ended up moving to New York because she sort of knew that was the center of where she wanted to be. But then you sort of start to see all these letters that Warden has written to other people, and because they've been saved in the papers of Louise Bourgeois, in Anne Ryan's papers, and you start to get a sense of how actively she was working on behalf of her fellow student. And I know that she felt so strongly from even the 40s and the 50s that she needed to ally herself with other women, that there was something about that that would advance her career in a way that I think she realized was not going to happen. I mean, she had a few male mentors, and I would say that her teacher at the Art Students League, whose name was Vaclav Fitlesil, was one of those mentors who she kept in touch with and was very dedicated to. But it was these women she met both at the Art Students League, at Atelier 17, and then she was kind of peripatetic and would go to fellowship. She would have a visiting professorship somewhere, or she'd be an artist at a sort of summer residency. And these connections that she made, I started to see all of them. And, she's really the one who starts to write to people and say, send me some of your work. I've met a person who is sympathetic to the modernist movement. Like, I want to show them your work. I want to show them some of your modern graphics. Send me what you have. And so you see that happening in some of this correspondence. And then you see her in the 60s trying to organize a women's only exhibition. And she and Louise Bourgeois had been in Vitlesil's class together, and it overlapped over some period of time. And I think, Bourgeois had this very ambivalent relationship with feminism, and wasn't sure she liked the idea of an all-women's show. But Warden is organizing this kind of thing in the 60s before we start to see these sort of larger movements to like go mine the archive and find unknown women artists. And so she's feeling that. And she had sort of a salon also with some other fellow artists who she met both at Atelier 17 and elsewhere. Like Dorothy Daner was part of this group, and they would meet together and they would talk about what some of the issues were that they faced as women artists in the New York arts community and sort of more broadly. So those were some of the connections that I started to see in letters. And then I think my second anecdote I just wanted to mention was this kind of crazy one. At the end of my research, I'd done a little project on Ellen Lanyon, who is an artist was based in Chicago. That was where she got her start. And I'd always known that she went to the University of Iowa to study with Mauricio Lazansky, who was another hub. And, again, we can talk about opportunities for women. Many women were not getting those university jobs at this time. It was just not open to them. So Mauricio Lazansky, who a fantastic artist but didn't speak very much English, somehow got this job at the University of Iowa, set up their printmaking program. And Ellen Lanyon was there, and she overlapped with Miriam Schapiro, who, of course, we all know as a great sort of instigator of feminist art in California at, I think it was Cal Arts. But anyway, Miriam Schapiro and Judy Chicago together, sort of thought of as some of the mothers of the feminist women's art movement. So I'd known that they overlapped. And then I just happened to be looking at Miriam Shapiro's papers, and I find that there's letters, there's correspondence between them. They were really good friends. And all of a sudden I'm reading Miriam Schapiro was there first, and she had a graduate assistantship being Mauricio Lazansky's secretary assistant, basically. And that when Ellen came in, she made sure that the job went to Ellen. And then years pass. And then, Miriam is starting to work with people like Lucy Lepard and obviously Judy Chicago, and they're trying to connect women. And she reaches back out to Ellen Lanyon, who's based in Chicago, and says, we're starting something called the West East Bag, which I think got shortened to WEB. And these were local organizations of women artists who would get together and they would talk about, like, where you could show your work.
Yeah.
Who was sympathetic to a woman artist. And so Ellen runs the chapter of WEB in Chicago. And so, and there's one, I think, out on the West Coast and one in the East Coast in New York. And so you start to see some of these connections that were fostered in printmaking in the 50s that are coming back into full circle in the 60s and the 70s as feminism is taking off. And I was just like, whoa, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so that for me was just like, it was just this spark. And I thought, what else is there? Who else was there? Who else should I be like reading their letters? What else is there to discover? I know there has to be more. So
yeah, those are both like amazing stories. And it just makes me think of, I don't know if you've heard the latest about Judy Chicago's prints, but her archive just was placed at the Jordan Schnitzer for all her prints in...
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so that'll be a really great... It's got a home in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum has just an incredible print collection, and Judy Chicago's prints have landed there. So it's very good news for people who like Judy Chicago and printmaking and archives. So...
Well, that's awesome. That's definitely awesome. But, when I was working, this is so hard to remember because it was back in February when we didn't have COVID.
It was a million years ago,
I know. And I was giving a paper about women artists and their archives and the missing aspect of artists who seem to have just disappeared from the historical record because, there's sometimes just a lack of archival research or archival material about them. And I had just in Googling this, I had seen that Judy Chicago initially had a really hard time finding anybody who would take her archives related to the dinner party.
Really?
And she sort of held on to them because she knew how important they were. But I think that just speaks to how we write art history. How do we write inclusive art history when we don't have the material? Because it hasn't become classified as important. The two women who I was speaking about earlier who were African Americans, one of them, kind of died in poverty, I think, in the Catskills, and no one really knows where. No one really knows very much about her, and I'm sure that there was a lot of interesting things that she had, and I think they've all vanished. And the other one was, I'm not kidding you, an orphan who grew up in an orphanage in New Hampshire and somehow made her way to New York. But she's like this ethereal character who I feel like I'm never going to be able to find anything about because nobody has cared enough to, she had to have had papers, archives, letters, clippings, something about her, and they're all gone.
And I think as we sort of take, our 21st century lens, and sort of turn it back on all of art history up until this point, I think this is something that we are kind of reckoning with, is that it's not necessarily that there were no artists of color working or there were no women working. It's just they were never allowed in the canon, that their contemporaries didn't say, oh, I should save these letters, or I should save these sketches, or even, I should save these finished works. And so we get this art history that is very white and very male and very straight and very cis. And it reminds me of that adage, history is written by the victors, right? So that's who the primary powers that be are, the ones that were deciding and organizing what goes in the books and what doesn't. And it's really difficult to think about the profound loss of all of these other human experiences in the art world that, as you say, when they're gone, they're gone for the most part.
They are. But you can, I mean, I think you can get around and you can look at things through different angles, and you can find a little bit, because schools still exist and they have records, and, museums still exist and sometimes they have records. And so you're able to get at things, but you can't really get the mother lode, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Those primary documents, which of course are the ideal for all historians out there. Yeah. I was going to say, I feel like I have a very sort of non-art historical question, because I was trained in art history myself. I did my master's degree in it. And so I kind of know that, like, trying to guess the inner workings of people is a little bit a no-no. Like, you're supposed to be like, nope, you use the facts that you have, right? But as I'm hearing these stories about the way these women interacted and stayed in contact and looked out for one another and wanted to create spaces that, were just for them, I really have this desire to know what their emotional life was like between them. Did you see, like, really like affection and kind of bonding in the sense that we're in it together? Any of that kind of maybe less hard and fast historical, the soft history, I don't know, or something like that, just because I identify with that so much, that feeling of really bonding between women and knowing that you share a shared experience, and how kind of profound that can be, and how important those really beautiful connections you can make with other women. It's something that's really important to me personally, and also as an art professional. And so if you're allowed to, as a historian who's just had a book published, to get a little bit more into those details, I don't know if there's any anecdotes or anything you can point to that have more of that maybe emotional reality of what was going on.
Well, so I think that you have to remember that I feel like most of the correspondence that people were having, sometimes they would just send these, like, quick little cards to one another. They would send letters just on sort of cheap paper. And so there was a lot more written down. And I don't know, I have a hard time imagining somebody calling somebody up and, like, having a phone call with them. I mean, I think phone calls, as I understand it from my mother, who was in, college in the late 60s, like, it was really expensive for her to call home to her family in Minnesota when she was at Manhattanville College. So I don't know how much there was that kind of friendship from sort of like telephonically.
Yeah.
But certainly I do feel that there were gatherings at people's studios. They were for sure gatherings at bars. I mean, they would congregate at these very masculinist places like the White Horse Tavern or the Cedar Bar, and others. That definitely read about other places where after the day was done, you would go and grab a drink or coffee if that was what you needed, and you would just sort of talk. And I think that's one of the things that that Hayter felt he did for New York, was really bring people together. That there was this cafe culture in Paris that didn't quite exist in New York, that he felt people didn't know each other as well. So I don't know, maybe there was a bit of that. I can't speak to any specific things that, I mean, except for these salons that I know that Ward and Day organized. But there are, at the Archives of American Art, a few oral histories with some of these women, and they're kind of amazing to listen to, because I feel like listening to somebody talk with be interviewed for sometimes 4 or 6 hours, you really almost feel like they're in the room with you and you're listening to them pour their heart and soul out, because they knew that this oral history was going to be part of the historical record. And I don't know, it really, like, gives you a sense of who they were and how they would react a little bit if presented with a certain situation.
Yeah.
So I was just going back actually and listening to one of those oral histories with an artist named Sue Fuller, who's not in the show at Arcadia, but is somebody who I admire and like very, very much. She was quite pioneering and very, very intellectually engaged, and was researching, for example, Mary Cassatt in the 1950s and thinking about her as a pioneering artist who was working on collages in the 1890s, because she felt the way that Cassatt was putting together her color aquatints was actually not that they were aquatints, that they were soft ground etchings, and that she had used newsprint to create the tone for those aquatints. Or that in some of her other early prints, you can see little scraps and pieces of fabric that she's sort of pressed into the soft ground. And so it's Sue Fuller who says in an article she wrote in the 1950s that, like, Cassatt, along with so many other women artists, were working in collage. They were scrapbooking, and they were doing collage before Picasso and Braque have been sort of designated as the founders of sort of collage in their Cubist way in, I think, 1913, 1914. And so anyway, just like listening to her talk again, it's like intoxicating to sort of to hear her. And she had a hard time reconciling with what feminism was, and felt that she'd worked so hard to get her work into collections, and she did these amazing prints, and then she would deconstruct string, and she would wrap it in this geometric way, sort of like op art, around open metal frames that had pegs on the side. And she got the work into like the Whitney and the Met and a lot of important collections. And then when all the sort of protesting was happening by feminist artists outside of the museums, Guerrilla Girls, saying, where are all the women artists? Why are they not part of the Whitney Biennial? She just sort of had a hard time, because she said, look, I worked really hard and I'm one of those token artists. And, I admire what they're doing in this agitation that they have about this. But I don't know, she couldn't quite fully see herself as a feminist. And what is so fascinating also is she was working with lace and very, handcrafty type things. Her mother had embroidered and had made, sort of other crocheted things and had died in the 1940s. And so she got all this material and she used it in her prints, including this amazing lace collar that her mother had bequeathed to her. She cut it up and she made it into the shape of a chicken and a hen. And then printed it as a hen, and so you can see the spiky collar. And then she added the beak and the legs and some feathers and things like that. And then it wasn't at all about it was a little bit about calling attention to the fact that, like, lace work and handwork that women were doing, she recognized in the 50s that this was an art form. That what women were doing was valuable, and that it wasn't second class and it wasn't lower on a sort of artistic hierarchy. But she wasn't able to be more vocal about it. And then 20 years later, Miriam Schapiro collects lace, like many women artists I found. She collected lace and she made a series of prints called Anonymous Was a Woman. And they're these beautiful sort of standalone prints of just pieces, scraps of lace. But there's one of a lace collar, just like the one that Sue Fuller had used. And then, I don't know, I've just been reading so much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her style and the lace collars that she had. I don't know, I couldn't stop thinking about this permutation of the lace collar from its Victorian origins in the 19th century through Sue Fuller, like using this collar that her mother had, cutting it up and turning it into something that was aesthetically, her goal. And then Miriam Schapiro being much more strident about her political thoughts about, these are anonymous objects that were created by women, and we should value them. And then, I see all these memes with, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is all just coming back full circle. But listening to Sue Fuller talk about this, talk about her mother and how, in this oral history, like talk about how crafty she was and how she was just the embodiment of a woman when she was growing up, and thinking about how how she stepped outside of the norm and became an artist and was not somebody who would stop if somebody said, you can't do that. Or that's not a woman's, that's not a woman's passion. You should give it up. And she would just say, no, you're wrong. I'm going to keep doing it. You get a sense from reading enough correspondence or listening to these amazing oral histories or interviews, if you're lucky enough to get them, that I think you can make these inferences. It's hard to be a historian, I think, and be slavish to what you read on a piece of paper, because you're never going to get exactly what you want. When you're reading, you're never going to get exactly the quote or the smoking gun. You always have to just sort of like piece it all together a little bit and see, what did she say here? What did he say here? Like, how do I put all this together? And then you can kind of make a story. And I think hopefully people think the story I'm telling is compelling, and that it has some truth, and it speaks to something that they also have experienced or they also have seen in their research, or it speaks to them today as an artist or even just a woman today. And I don't know, I think the more we can pull these kind of stories out and we can remind people that this has always been here, that women have always been fighting this struggle to make themselves known, to, I don't know, speak some truth to a community that may not want to hear it, but they're there. They're there and they need to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely. And I always think that there's a comfort in seeing the women who have done it before us and the bravery that they had and the risks that they took. And it makes me really emotional to think about it, just that while there's so far to go in terms of equality in our society for women, for people of color, for non-binary people. But, looking back into history and seeing what they were up against compared to what we're up against and the progress that has been made, that's always a bit invigorating for me to see that it's like, okay, like if you could take this on when circumstances were what they were in 1948, I think I can take this on when circumstances are what they are in 2020. And learning that history is really important for that for me.
No, 100%. I mean, I think when New York was locked down in April and we were just struggling so much with childcare and just life and the horror of it all, and I would really often, my mind would go back to a specific person, an artist who I had studied, and I would think about, I don't know, just the choices that she had to make, the hurdles that she had to overcome because of either World War II, having to leave leave Czechoslovakia because they were Jew and they were going to, end up in a concentration camp, or just women who had to live through the Depression. And it just all came full circle for me of just like living through this moment, and yes, you can persevere. And yes, it may be hard, really hard for a while longer, but there's something at the end of this. I don't know what it is, but we're going to get out of it. And this is like the work that I did on these women is a constant reminder to me that like there are bumps and ups and downs, and these people were amazing, and I don't know, they persevered in their own ways.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really beautiful note to kind of start wrapping up on as we're getting towards our hour recording mark. But please let people know the title of your book, where they can find it, and then also the full title of the exhibition and where they can find that in 2022. And then also, you've got amazing resources on your website for just the biographical supplements for 97 of these, of female artists from Atelier 17. So just please plug all the resources that you've got for these, because you've got some amazing ones out there.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so book title is The Women of Atelier 17, Modernist Printmaking in Midcentury New York. It's a 2019 imprint from Yale Press. You can get it at your local bookstore. I tend to prefer bookshop.org, where money goes to local bookshops, but you can also get it at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and those places as well. The exhibition at Arcadia University is called Proto-Feminism in the Print Studio. It will be fall of 2022. Arcadia is this gorgeous liberal arts college that used to be called Beaver College. It was an all-women's college outside of Philadelphia. And they have this amazing space. It was a former, I feel like, a power station. So it's a really cool space as well. And then, Miranda, as you were alluding to, I did, after I finished my book, I did go through and try and find something about everybody who was on the Atelier 17 roster who was identified as female. And so there's a website that's linked, it's a subdomain of my website. So you would go to atelier17.christinaweyl.com. It's its own sort of resource. You can pull up pictures of the artists, in many cases, sometimes not, a picture of their work and a short biography. And for some of them, I might have just been able to say, I know that she studied at Atelier 17 around 1950 something, or that I know that she was from Alabama. Whatever it was, I threw it in there. And I have people write me all the time with follow-ups, and I know something about this, or I have one of these artists' works. So that's been kind of fun to kind of get these random inquiries from time to time with people who are like, oh my gosh, I've had this hanging in my dining room for years, or like, she was my great aunt and we didn't know anything about her. We're so grateful to have something, to know something about her. So definitely check that out, because that was a fun thing to put together, a labor of love.
Yes, I was having a very good time clicking on names I didn't recognize and finding a little story there, a bit about who they were, and the photographs of the women, or when you have those, are incredible. And yeah, it's a well worth some so I want to say like a lockdown activity that won't depress you, or something like that.
Yes, yeah, a lockdown activity if you're not homeschooling your children right now.
Yeah,
if you are, bookmark it and save it for another day.
Definitely. Well, we'll put a link to that in the show notes, and a link to your book, and a link to your website. And it has been just absolutely a pleasure to learn about your research and all of the women in Atelier 17. And yeah, I guess just I wish you the best of luck for getting through the rest of COVID in New York. For sure.
Thank you, and same to you in Bangkok. And I hope that our paths will cross in person at some point.
Yes,
I feel like there's something about COVID that has brought us so much closer as a community. I mean, I feel like every time I go out in New York, I see somebody I know, like literally somebody I went to high school with, or I haven't seen. You know, New York has just gotten to be smaller. And I think in a way, like, even though this is a global pandemic, it's kind of like made everything a little sharper. Like, okay, here are some people I know and I really like, and like, I hope we get to see each other at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my husband's family is from New York, so we go back there. And then also I'm here in Bangkok for at least a handful of years, and there's an incredible printmaking scene here in Thailand. Incredible. So if you and your family ever want to take a Southeast Asian holiday, beautiful weather, beautiful food, and just exceptionally talented, warm printmaking community here too. So I could give you a tour.
Oh, amazing. Well, maybe we'll leave the kids behind.
Yeah.
And come.
Gonna say, I was like, maybe there'd be a seat in there for book number 2 if Thailand printmaking. Yeah.
No, totally. No. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, and let's stay in touch. Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Stephanie Santana. We'll talk about her finding art through MySpace, taking up printmaking through illustration gigs, historical textile traditions carrying religious and ancestral meaning, the importance of archives, and how being a mother affected her practice. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.